Before the trucks left that morning, the commanding officer told his men that any of them who did not feel up to what was coming could step out of the ranks. He had no orders to say it. Nobody above him had authorized it. When the first man walked forward, one of the captains started shouting at him, and the commander cut the captain off mid-sentence and put the man under his protection in front of everyone. So the offer was real, and every man in that half-circle could see it. Nearly 500 men heard it, and what happened in the next 17 hours is why we are still arguing about. The place was Józefów, in the Lublin district of occupied Poland. The date was the 13th of July, 1942. The unit was Reserve Police Battalion 101 out of Hamburg. The officer was Major Wilhelm Trapp. His men shot about 1,500 people that day. Women, children, the elderly. The Jewish community of a town that had existed for 200 years. Here is the fact that has kept historians circling this morning for 30 years. 12 men stepped out of nearly 500, and nothing happened to them. No court-martial, no punishment detail, no execution. Not that day, not in the 16 months that followed. And not, this is the part that matters, in any of the hundreds of post-war trials where German defendants swore refusal would have meant death. In 4 decades of those trials, no defendant and no defense attorney ever produced a single documented case of a German shot for refusing to kill unarmed civilians. Not one. So the numbers to hold are 3. 500, 12, 0. 500 men offered a way out. 12 who took it. 0 who paid the price they all later swore they would have paid. We have covered obedience on this channel before. In our first episode, a man in a laboratory coat told volunteers to keep going, and most of them kept going. That pressure was vertical. Józefów is not that. Here, the authority explicitly released them. The man at the top of the chain stood in front of them with tears on his face and said, in effect, "You do not have to do this." Which means the pressure that held them in the ranks was not coming from above. It was coming from the men on either side of them. That is the subject of this episode. Not why people obey. Why people cannot afford to be the one who steps out, and what it costs the ones who do. Those 12 did pay something, and the record tells us with unusual precision what it was. And underneath that, one more question. What was different about them? Were they braver? Did they see something the others could not? The record answers that in the men's own words, and it is not the answer anyone wants. We come back to it at the end. We start with who these men were because almost everything you would guess is wrong. The most useful thing about this battalion is that somebody wrote it all down. The roster survived, and between 1962 and the early 1970s, prosecutors in Hamburg interrogated 210 former members, more than 40% of the unit, answering questions 25 years after the fact. The historian Christopher Browning worked through that testimony and published the result in 1992. What the interrogations show is a unit assembled from the leftovers. The order police were the ordinary uniformed police of Germany, and as the war expanded, the new reserve battalions were filled with civilian draftees the army had already rejected as too old for the front. Battalion 101 was one of those. The average age of the rank and file was 39. Almost all had been born and raised in Hamburg. About 63% came from working-class backgrounds, and few of those were skilled. Dock workers and truck drivers mostly, warehousemen, seamen, waiters. Another 35% were white-collar, 2% were professionals, a couple of druggists and a school teacher. Almost none had any education after leaving school at 14. About a quarter carried Nazi Party membership cards in 1942, most having joined in 1937 or later. In Germany, that was the year you joined if you wanted the card, rather than the belief. They were old enough that their formative years happened before Hitler, and Hamburg was one of the least Nazified cities in the country. Browning's assessment is blunt. Measured on age, on geography, on class, this was not special selection for mass murder. It was not even random selection. It was negative selection. If you set out to build a unit unlikely to become killers, you would build this one. Their commander fit the pattern. Wilhelm Trapp was 53, a career policeman who had come up through the ranks, a decorated veteran of the First World War. His men called him Papa Trapp. He had joined the party in December 1932, and the SS never took him. By the standards of the organization he served, he was sentimental and weak. His two young captains were the opposite. Julius Wolauf and Wolfgang Hoffmann were in their late 20s, both party members, both SS, both professionals on the way up. Even in testimony a quarter of a century later, neither hid his contempt for the old man who commanded them. Hold that contrast. It becomes the whole story. And hold the town, because Józefów was not an abstraction, and its people were not a number. Józefów Bielgórajski sat about 20 miles from Bielgóraj, in the far southeast of occupied Poland. Jews had lived there since the early 18th century, at points more than half the town. The synagogue still stands. It is now the town library. The community was led by a council under a president named Baruch Goldstein, alongside the pre-war rabbi Shimon Parzynchevsky. In the spring of 1941, 1,100 destitute Jews deported from Konin were dumped into the town, and the community absorbed them. By the summer of 1942, the recorded Jewish population was just over 2,100, on a bread ration of 72 grams a day. That May, 130 people had been killed in the streets and the quarry. None of them knew that a battalion of middle-aged Hamburg policemen had arrived in the district 3 weeks earlier and had, as of that morning, never killed anyone. The orders reached Trapp around the 11th of July. On the 12th, he called his officers together and told them what the battalion was going to do. One officer went straight to Trapp's adjutant that night, a reserve lieutenant in 1st Company, a man Browning calls Heinz Buchmann, owner of a family lumber business in Hamburg and, for the record, a party member since 1937. He said he would in no case take part in an action in which defenseless women and children were shot, and asked for a different assignment. He was given one, escorting the men selected for labor to Lublin. Nobody stopped him, nobody threatened him. He asked, and the answer was yes. The rest of the battalion left Bielgóraj around 2 in the morning and reached Józefów as the sky was lightening. Trapp assembled them in a half circle and spoke. Every witness who described that speech described a man barely holding himself together. Choking voice, tears. He told them the orders were not to his liking either, but came from above, and offered a frame that might help. Bombs were falling on German women and children at home. It was, as Browning puts it, a rather pathetic attempt at a justification. And then Trapp made the offer. If any of the older men among them did not feel up to the task that lay before him, he could step out. He paused. After some moments, one man from 3rd Company walked forward. Browning gives him the name Otto Julius Schimke. Captain Hoffmann, who had arrived that morning and missed the officers' meeting, was furious that one of his own had broken ranks first and started in on him. Trapp cut him off and put Schimke under his protection. Then 10 or 12 others stepped forward. They turned in their rifles and waited for a further assignment. That is the moment the whole argument lives in. 2 explanations were offered for it over the next 50 years. The first is the one these men reached for afterwards. It has a name in German law, Befehlsnotstand. Browning calls the version that matters here putative duress. Duress is when refusal would genuinely destroy you. Putative duress is when you believe it would, act on that belief, and the belief is false. At Józefów, it was not even present. The commander invited them to refuse, then defended the first man who did, in front of the whole battalion, against a captain's rage. Unwritten ground rules settled over the unit afterwards. In the large actions, men who would not shoot were not compelled. And when an officer tried to force a known non-shooter, the man could decline, because both knew the officer could not take it to Trapp. And the wider record holds. The German scholar Herbert Jaeger and the prosecutors who built these cases through the 1960s established that nobody could document a single instance in which a German who refused to kill unarmed civilians suffered the consequences thousands of defendants swore were inevitable. The historian David Kitterman went looking specifically for men who had said no, and found 135 individuals or groups. Some were beaten, demoted, transferred, threatened. None died for it. In a system that handed down tens of thousands of death sentences for offenses as small as stealing mail, refusing to shoot civilians was not one of them. So the first explanation collapses. They were not under a gun. They were under something else. The second mechanism is the one they almost never named. Its academic name comes from Morton Deutsch and Harold Gerard in 1955. Normative social influence. The distinction is between changing your behavior because the group has given you new information about reality and changing it because you need the group to accept you. The second requires no belief at all. You can think the group is completely wrong and go along anyway, because the cost of separation is paid immediately in the only social world you have. The laboratory science of that is our 6th episode. One line is enough here. A person will contradict the evidence of their own eyes rather than be the only one in the room saying something different. Now put it in a half circle of 500 men at dawn. To step out was to walk into open ground and let the entire unit watch you do it. As one policeman said afterwards, who would have dared to lose face before the assembled troops? Another was blunter about what held him in place. If I am asked why I shot with the others in the first place, he said, I must answer that no one wants to be thought a coward. Not a threat, not a belief, a word. You will recognize the shape of it from any organization you have belonged to. The mechanism does not require a war. It requires a group whose good opinion you cannot easily replace. Which leaves a question. If the pressure was social, the men who stepped out were the ones who could survive being disliked. What makes a person able to survive that? Hold it. Watch what the day did first. The roundup began at first light, and the marketplace filled quickly. The battalion doctor drew the outline of a human body on the ground and showed First Company how to use a fixed bayonet, laid between the shoulder blades, as an aiming guide. Then the trucks began running to the forest. We are not going to walk through the 17 hours. What matters is that the offer did not close at dawn. It stayed open all day, and we can count the people who took it. Several men went to their company captain and asked for a different assignment. He refused them flatly. Others went instead to the first sergeant, who gave them guard duty on the road. Same request, different desk, different outcome. By midday, that sergeant was releasing the older men who came and asked. In Second Company, a sergeant offered his men the same out before they started, and nobody took it. Then they started, and men began asking to stop. One got through his first victim, an elderly woman, and could not continue. Another found that the second person in front of him was a German Jew, a mother from Kassel with her daughter, and asked out. That was not a freak occurrence. Several of these policemen recognized Jews from Hamburg and Bremen in Józefów, and some had guarded the collection point from which those people were deported the previous autumn. And in the confusion of small groups moving in and out of the forest, some men simply stayed near the trucks, looking busy. One was noticed. His comrades swore at him for shirking. He ignored them and kept doing it. Dozens of small refusals, none of them punished, none of them stopping anything. By dusk, about 1,500 people were dead. The men returned to Bilgerai, were issued extra alcohol, ate almost nothing, and barely spoke. One woke that night from a nightmare and fired his weapon into the ceiling of the barracks. By silent consensus, Józefów was never discussed again. One man's word for it, 25 years later, was taboo. And then the third mechanism took over, which explains the 16 months that followed. In 1989, the social psychologists Herbert Kellman and Lee Hamilton published a framework for what they called crimes of obedience, built on three processes. Authorization. The act is sanctioned by a legitimate source, so the moral question is never asked, because it has been asked for you. Routinization. It is broken into steps and repeated until it is a job with procedures rather than a decision. Dehumanization. The victims are placed outside the category of people you owe anything to. Józefów supplied all three at once. After it, the battalion ran on the second, because the work changed. Instead of shooting people at close range, the battalion mostly cleared ghettos and put people onto trains for Treblinka. Auxiliaries brought in from a training camp did the beating and the driving. Other men, somewhere else, did the killing. And the change in their accounts of themselves is stark. They could not describe Józefów without visible distress 3 decades later. They describe the deportations with almost total detachment, using a phrase that recurs through the transcripts. I was only in the police cordon there. Same men, vastly more victims. No memory of participating. Browning kept the arithmetic. Between July 1942 and November 1943, this one battalion of fewer than 500 middle-aged reservists shot at least 38,000 people and put at least 45,200 more onto trains to Treblinka. The men who found the first 1,500 unbearable found the next 80,000 routine. There is one thing the arithmetic does not capture, and it is what makes this case contested. Everything you have just heard comes from the men themselves, decades later, under criminal investigation. Which brings us to the fight. In 1996, 4 years after Browning's book, a young Harvard political scientist named Daniel Goldhagen published Hitler's Willing Executioners. He had read substantially the same interrogations of the same battalion from the same archive, and he arrived at the opposite conclusion. Goldhagen's argument is monocausal by design. The explanation, in his account, is not situation, not conformity, not authority. It is a specific and pervasive form of German anti-Semitism. Eliminationist, he calls it, embedded in German culture for centuries, which meant ordinary Germans did not merely become killers when the state asked. They wanted to. And his strongest evidence is the fact this whole episode is built on Trapp's offer. If the men were free to refuse, and they were, then their participation was voluntary. Goldhagen presses that hard, and he is right to. He also argues that the gratuitous cruelty in the record, cruelty, no order required, cannot be explained by conformity, because conformity produces compliance, not enthusiasm. And he notes, correctly, that Browning's account leaves a hole exactly where anti-Semitism should be. The interrogators barely asked, the men barely mentioned it. Browning had written, before Goldhagen's book, that he did not know whether the silence meant it had not mattered, or whether it had mattered so completely they could not say it out loud. He left the question open. Goldhagen closed it. Browning's reply, published as an afterword, does not dispute the two things that matter most. Both agree these were ordinary Germans drawn from a cross-section of society, and both agree they were not coerced. His objection is to method. His central charge is selection. Goldhagen's stated rule was to discard testimony that sounded self-exculpating unless corroborated elsewhere. In practice, Browning argues, that meant discarding any statement about a state of mind that did not fit the hypothesis, while corroborating evidence about states of mind is nearly impossible to find. A method that can only confirm itself is not a test. Most of the profession sided with Browning on method. Raoul Hilberg, the founding historian of the field, was scathing. Ruth Bettina Byrne and Norman Finkelstein published a book against it. And Goldhagen's was an international bestseller that sold enormously in Germany and won that country's democracy prize. Which tells you something about the distance between what historians found persuasive and what a public wanted said aloud. The question Goldhagen raised is not settled, and Browning says so himself. He concedes that cruelty in the Holocaust is something historians have not adequately explained. His own conclusion is narrower than it is usually reported. That these men were willing executioners does not mean they wanted to be genocidal executioners. Browning thinks the distinction is real. Goldhagen thinks it is an evasion. You are not required to pick. But notice what both are working from. 210 interrogations, 25 years after the fact, of men under criminal investigation who had spent a quarter of a century not talking about it. Browning is explicit about how fragile that is. Such testimony is shaped by what the investigators thought to ask, and by forgetting, evasion, and outright lying. Here is one measure of it. Trapp's offer, the pivot of the whole case, was recalled in precisely that form by exactly 2 of the interrogated men. Several others initially remembered something different, a call for volunteers for the firing squad. Others, confronted with their comrades' testimony, said they had not heard that part or could not remember it. A number of men in that half-circle either did not hear the moment they were given a choice or could not afford to remember it, which is where the last mechanism comes in. There is a body of work on what it costs a brain to stand apart, and it is worth reporting accurately. In 2003, Naomi Eisenberger, Matthew Lieberman, and Kipling Williams put volunteers into a scanner and had them play an online ball-tossing game with 2 other players who, partway through, stopped throwing to them. Not insult, not threat. Exclusion from a trivial game with strangers. The anterior cingulate cortex became more active during exclusion, and the more active it was, the more distress people reported. The popular version of that became, rejection is physically painful. The claim is contested. Chung-Wan Wu and colleagues in 2014 found that physical pain and social rejection produce distinguishable patterns inside those same regions, and others argue the region tracks salience in general rather than pain. The honest statement is narrower and still useful. Being excluded, even trivially, registers fast in a system the brain also uses for distress, before you have decided anything. The second study is more directly on point. In 2005, Gregory Burns and colleagues had people do a spatial reasoning task after seeing what a group of peers had answered. When participants went along with a group that was wrong, the changes appeared in visual and spatial processing regions, as though the group had altered what they saw, not what they said. When they stood against the group, the activity appeared in the amygdala and the caudate. Note what that is not. It is not a finding that independence is correct or courageous. It is a finding that independence is expensive. Going along barely registered as a decision. Standing apart engaged the machinery of threat. In a half-circle of 500 men, at dawn, being watched, with a few seconds to decide. So, what happened to the men who stepped out? They were left alone. Once a man had established himself as someone who would not shoot, he was quietly excluded from the killing, including from the Jew hunts, the patrols that went looking for people hiding in the forests. Browning's phrase for the consequences, they were not grave, but not nothing. The first man out, the one Browning calls Shimka, was sent on almost every anti-partisan operation the battalion ran, and never on a Jew hunt. He suspected correctly that both traced back to that morning. Another drew extra guard duty and the unpleasant assignments, and was not promoted. He was told roughly why. The officers wanted only men with them, and in their eyes, he was no man. Others who felt as he did got the same treatment, and the protection was not absolute. At least one man was put on a firing squad by an officer with a grudge, precisely because he had not yet been on one. Buchmann, the lumber merchant, went furthest. After Józefów, he told Trapp that from then on he would not take part in any action against Jews unless explicitly ordered to. He made no attempt to hide it. His whole company knew. He wrote to Hamburg asking to be recalled, on the grounds that the battalion was doing work that was not police work. Trapp never confronted him. He protected him and routed the orders around him. In November 1942, Buchmann got his transfer home. He was made adjutant to the police president of Hamburg, and then he was promoted. That is the price of dissent as this record documents it. Bad assignments, no promotion. Being told you are not a man. And in the one case of open, sustained, principled refusal, a transfer home and a better job. Which brings us back to the question. The men answered it themselves, and it is not the answer anyone wants. One explained that he accepted the disadvantages because he was not a career policeman and did not intend to become one. He was going back to being a craftsman with his own business, so it did not matter that his police career would not prosper. Buchmann said the same, asked why he had behaved differently from the two SS captains. He was older, he said, and a reserve officer, and it was not important to him to be promoted because he had a prosperous business waiting at home. The company chiefs were young men and career policemen who wanted to become something. Then he added one sentence, the only one of its kind in that entire body of testimony. Through his earlier business dealings, especially the ones abroad, he had already known many Jews.
That is the answer the record gives. Not conscience, not courage, independence. The men who could say no were the men who could afford to. They had somewhere else to be, an income the police did not control, and a life that would still exist after the group stopped approving of them. Browning's summary of what these men could articulate 25 years later is two things side by side, crushing conformity and careerism. And they knew it, which is why they never claimed more. Almost every non-shooter told his comrades the same line, that he was too weak for it. Not that he was too good for it, because claiming to be too good would have been a verdict on the men still standing in the line, and they were not willing to deliver one. They removed themselves, and then they protected the reputations of everyone who had not. So the 12 did not stop the killing, and did not try to. They were an exit, taken by the few for whom it was cheap, which is the reversal, and it is Browning's own. Trapp's offer was extraordinary. He knows of no other case in the literature where a commander so openly invited and protected non-participation. And the most important fact about it is not that it was unusual. It is that it did not matter. Like any other unit, Reserve Police Battalion 101 killed the people it had been told to kill. The choice was real, and it changed almost nothing about the day. What it changed was the alibi. After Józefów, no man in that battalion could truthfully say he had not been asked. Trapp was hanged in Poland in December 1948. Browning's last line about all of it is a question. Everywhere, he writes, societies condition people to defer to authority. Everywhere people want to get ahead. Everywhere the peer group sets the moral norms. If these men could become killers under those conditions, what group of men cannot? There is one final detail, and it belongs to the 12. To get access to those court records, Browning had to promise the German authorities he would not use the men's real names. 4 are exceptions, because their names appear in archives outside Germany, where there was no confidentiality left to protect. Wilhelm Trapp, Julius Wolof, Wolfgang Hoffmann, Hartwig Gnade, the commander and the 3 company commanders. Everyone else carries a name Browning invented, which means the men who stepped out that morning, the first to break ranks, the lumber merchant who would not stop saying it out loud, the craftsman who did not need the promotion, appear nowhere in the public record under their own names. The men who said no are anonymous. The men who gave the orders are not.